this week, we're going to be taking a further look at how Aspire works, and we're going to look at the idea of adding new Aspire packages into our existing application. Let's just take a quick recap of what we've got. So we've got here our Blazor pre-rendering solution, and what we'd added was this app host, which does the Aspire orchestration, and we can see what we had in there. If you look in the program, it hooks up the API, our backend with the data, and then our Blazor front end. And when we run that, then it gives us the Aspire dashboard, and we saw we can go and look at that Blazor front end and other things as well. But remember, the data we've got in here is completely fake. So if we go and look in the API, we can see that on the program, we've just got these couple of endpoints, and all they're doing is returning dummy data.books, dummy data.authors, which is just, as the name suggests, some dummy data. So what we want to do to make this more realistic is actually put that data into a database. But then, of course, we have the further problem, which is what Aspire is trying to solve, that if I hook this up to a local database when I'm in development, then I've got to do some extra configuration to get that onto a different database when I'm running deployed in Azure. And that's something that Aspire solves with the idea of Aspire packages. So let's take a look at that. And so what I'm going to do is go into the app host and right-click on that and go to Add, and then you can see we've got these .NET Aspire packages that we can add. And if I click on that, what we actually get is just the NuGet package manager with a particular filter setup, because the Aspire packages are just a subset of the NuGet packages. And you can see there are lots and lots of things we have available, and more coming along all the time. So we've got Redis, for example. There's SQL Server. That's what we're going to be using in this video. But you can see Postgres, all sorts of other things available as well if you wanted to make use of those. But I'm just going to have a look at SQL Server as an example. So let's click on that and install it. And that will give us the ability to have a SQL Server database running as a Docker image and completely easy to deploy and manage and that sort of thing. So we've added that in there. And let's now go to the app host and go into the program, and let's now configure that. So before I do the API, because it's the API that's going to be using the SQL Server, I'm going to say var db equals, and then we're going to say builder, and then .add SQL Server. So that's been made available to us because of that package I just added. And then what we do is we put in the name of the SQL Server instance that we're going to be creating just as this one-off inside the Docker image. So I'm just going to call that SQL Server. Then what we also do is typically give this a with lifetime. And that just allows us to speed things up a little bit, in that it will reuse the same image each time rather than having to recreate it every time. And so we go for .persistent there. And so that means it'll be a bit slow when we first run it because it's got to create the Docker image, but then it'll reuse the existing one unless we make any changes. And then finally, having created a SQL Server instance, we do a .add database, and then there we give it the name of the database we're going to use within that instance. So I'm just going to call this library DB. And so that's got that created and orchestrated as part of Aspire. That database, though, is going to be used inside the API. So that means on the API, we now do a dot, and then we have a with reference, which is just the same as the with reference we've seen where the front end is referencing the API. The API is referencing this SQL Server. So we do a with reference onto DB. And again, very similarly, we do a wait for, because we don't want to start up the API until the DB is ready. And so that's what we have there. And so that is going to put together and launch our Docker image with SQL Server in there. And if you've done Docker in the more traditional way, that typically involves writing lots of YAML files, which, although if you're used to it, it's quite a good way to go. One of the nice things about Aspire is that you're doing your configuration in C#, which is a language that we should be familiar with as C# developers. It's similar to the fact that with Blazor, you're writing your front end in C#, although there are lots of other good ways to do that using TypeScript and things like that. Why do something different when you can do something the same? So that's the idea we have here. So that now means that as part of our orchestration, we are going to have this SQL Server instance launched. Now, in order for that to work, although Aspire will create the Docker image, we still have to have something on our local machine to actually manage those containers. There's various ways you can do it, but you can see here I've just got Docker Desktop as one of the main ones to do that. And at the moment, there are no containers running in there. But we'll see that will change in a bit, because if I launch this, and you'll see that now it's giving us the SQL Server. Inside the SQL Server, we've got the library DB, and then we've got the other two we had before. And at this stage, this is going to take a little while because it actually has to generate the Docker image. You can see there it's getting hold of the actual source for the SQL Server, so 2022 latest, and it's going to take a little while to do that. And we can just see it's coming in, so the SQL Server is available there. You can also see that the other two, the API and the Blazor, are waiting because we did that wait for, but now we've got everything up and running and working together. Although it's not going to show anything different because we haven't looked in this database yet, we haven't even structured it. But one thing we can see is if we now bring up Docker, there you can see that it's got that container running in Docker Desktop. So you're using the two things alongside each other, Aspire and Docker Desktop. So let's now make some use of that. So we're going to need to use that inside the API. So we've already added the reference. What we need to do now is put the code into the API to make that work. And so what we'll do is go to the API and then add to that another NuGet package, because we're going to need to reference SQL Server. So we'll do a NuGet package. And in this one, we're going to look for a thing called Aspire dot, and then you can see we've got Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and we're going to go for SQL Server on this one. So this slightly different name from the one we had in the app host. This is the one that's actually going to make use of it. So let's install that. And then let's do the things that are necessary. And most of what we're going to do here is just straightforward Entity Framework. So the Entity Framework package has come in with that Aspire Entity Framework package. So the first thing we need to do is in data, we're going to add our DB context. So new class, and we'll call this library context. And then just do the straightforward stuff that we always do. So done lots of videos on this before if you want to look at it. So DB context, and that will get hold of the namespace that we've just had in there. And then in there, then we just got to put in a constructor, and the constructor, remember, will take a DB context options generic for the context. We'll call that options, and then all you do with that is pass that through to the base class. Again, the AI is being overly helpful. And then the other thing we have to do, nothing new here, is we have the DB sets for each of our data types. And again, the AI isn't brilliant here because you no longer need, and I don't think you've needed for a couple of versions of .NET, to have that null bang on the end there. So we can get rid of that and then just put in the book there. And then also duplicate that because we'll have another one for our author class and call that authors. So nothing new at all there. That would be the way you do it with Entity Framework for any kind of database. We then need to configure that. So let's go into our program. And then what we can do up here is on that builder, let's do a builder dot, and then rather than doing the builder.services.addDB context, which you can actually do, but there is a shortcut for that. There is just this add SQL Server DB context, and then we specify the context, which it's worked out for us, is our library context, and then we specify the database. And this is where we'll see the magic of what we get with Aspire, because just like with all the other things, if we just look, say, at the front end, remember in the front end, in our app settings, we could just reference the name of the Aspire project, so Blazor Rendering API in that case, and the actual details of the URL were worked out for us. Well, exactly the same thing goes with this SQL package and indeed any of the other packages you go for. So we had called this one, if we go to the app host, you can see we called the database library DB. And so we can simply use that because we've done the with reference. And so back in here, we can just pass that in as the name of the database, and that will know that we're actually using the one that we've configured in Aspire. We could read that in from the config file if we wanted to, but it's never really going to change. That's just the name we have there configured for Aspire. So that will bring that in. Next thing we'll do, let's actually populate the database. Now, it's always an issue when you're particularly doing demos or just starting something up. You need to throw some data in there, even though your real data will come by different means. But we'll do that. So let's, in here, after we've got the app, I'm just going to put in a call to a function that I'll call create data. And then down the bottom, as a local function, we'll actually implement that. So I'm going to call that create data. And then the thing to remember, DB context is always injected scoped. And when you're doing it here, you've got to do your own scope. So we're going to say using var, and then you can see that's all fine. So we'll have that scope. I don't want the rest of it. And that app, remember, is just captured because this is a local function inside a function, so you can use that app variable. Then we'll get hold of the context. So we're going to say using var db equals, and then scope, get required service, library context. So that's all good. And then we'll start making some use of this. So we're going to do a db.database.ensure created. So that will make sure it creates the database using our structure. And then we'll just do something like this. In fact, in this case, I'll trust it on the AI. So if there aren't any books, then we'll add in our data and we'll just use the same old dummy data for books. And then also let's do an if there aren't any authors, we're going to do the dummy data for authors. And then of course, we'll have to do a db.savechanges to commit that. So that'll create our initial data. A little bit of a gotcha here to watch out for. If we take a look at books, you can see that actually we've got IDs on there. And that was great when we were just using local data, but when we want to put this into a database, remember the database will generate the IDs, so we want to get rid of that on both the books and the authors. And then one other thing we'll do, just so we can distinguish between the dummy data and the real data, let's just add one extra item in there. So let's put in a book, so let's say db.authors.add, and then we obviously don't want an ID, and equally, we don't want it to be Ian Fleming. Let's just put in Jasper Kent. And so that just means that we'll be able to see a difference because we'll have an extra author and then we'll know we've connected to the database. So let's not actually use that as yet. We're still going to be reading the dummy data, but that should at least create the database. So let's run that all up now. And you can see that started much, much quicker. That's because we had that persistent mode when we were configuring the Docker image. So that should have created the data. How can we tell whether it has? Well, there's a couple of things we can do. One is we could go to the logging for the API. And if we look in there you can see it's doing all of those inserts to create the data. So that looks good. Another thing we can do, though, is we can actually take a look at the database itself, just as if it was running in the normal way, not as a Docker image. And the way that we do that is if we go to the API, and we look at the details for the API that you can see here, and then scroll down a bit to these environment variables, there you can see we've got a connection strings. And if we take a look at that, and in fact we can see it a bit better like that, that is the connection string that it has given us for our database. So you can see what it does is it by default creates a user called SA, System Administrator, and then generates a random password that is the thing we're going to use to connect. Now, obviously, this is all hidden away. It's actually stored in the user secrets. If we just were to go into here and right-click on there and look at Manage User Secrets, there you can see is where it's got that generated password. So that's another place you can look at it. But obviously, that you don't want anyone to get hold of, and that's why we've got it hidden away like that. But what we can therefore do is use that connection string, if I just copy it, to actually get to the database. So if I bring up SQL Server Management Studio, and if I connect to a new database engine, and you can see here, if I go to additional connection parameters, I can just paste in that connection string and then connect to that, and that will actually connect even though it's running in a Docker image. So the exposure of the address to get hold of it is all there for us. And if we look in databases, there's our library DB. there's our tables. We've got the books and the authors. And if we just look at the data, there we've got the 4 books. And then in the authors, there we've got it with the extra author that I added on the end. So everything's worked fine there. So that's all good. Last thing we've therefore got to do is actually make use of that. Because remember, at the moment, if we take a look, say, at the front end, then it's just got the 2 authors, and that's how we know that it hadn't used the database. So pretty simple to fix that. Let's just go back in here for the final step for the development. And if we go into, again, the program for the API, and then on the 2 endpoints that we had, we're going to need to now inject our DB context. So we'll just inject library context, call that DB, and then really simple, we can just now say db.books rather than saying dummy-data.books. Same on the second one, change that to DB. And now when we run that up, we can see it's all looking pretty much the same. But if we now go to our Blazor, then you can see we've got that extra name on the end of the authors, and therefore we can see that that's working. Another way we can see that it's working, again, if we go to the logging for the API, so go in here, then there you can see the 2 selects that it's doing to get all of the authors and all of the books. So now clearly working with the database there, which is all pretty good. And we can see how neat that is, and really very, very simple for configuring any one of these Docker container images that we want to use. Last thing we want to do there, like we were doing before, is we're going to want to update the deployment there. So remember, we saw in the last video, this is already deployed, but let's deploy it now with the SQL Server. So let's just go to publish. Got to have a little bit of time just to refresh. So like we did before, because this takes a while, we'll just skip ahead. So that's all done. So then let's hit the publish button. And again, that's going to take a long time. So we'll skip ahead again. Okay, so that's done. And again, let's just scroll down and look at the things that it's deployed. And you can see the additional thing. It's got that SQL Server. But let's go to the resource group again and just log in there. And there you can see all the resources in the resource group. Same sort of thing we looked at last time. And so if we just take a quick look down there at the SQL Server container, there you can see that's the extra thing that's been deployed. And if we look at the dashboard, click on that there, then again, we'll need to log in, because remember, this is all for me as the developer, even though it's deployed. And it's popped up that dashboard now. And once this loads, it should be looking a bit more like what we're expecting. So there we've got the SQL Server. And if we just go for the Blazor pre-rendering, and we can see it's got that data in there. There we can see the extra name, Jasper Kent, as an author. That shows it was getting it from the database. And we should also be able to look at the console for the API and see it's got the selects. It would also, of course, in that case, have done the generation of the initial data, because that was the first time we started it, but subsequent times it would just do the selects. So really, that's how easy it was. And I think once we'd got the Aspire done, which may have been a little tricky in the earlier videos and getting the initial deployment publishing done, now we can see how easy it is to add new features. And we didn't have to put any effort at all really into going into Azure in one way or another and creating the SQL Server database there. We just used the container version, and that just worked straight away, both locally and on Azure. So that's really showing us the full power of Aspire. And it's not just SQL Server. We saw lots and lots of other packages that are available. So hope you enjoyed that one. If you did, do click the like button, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.